America's cheapest power has a Canadian problem. Not oil, not gas, not pipelines. Water. A river that starts in British Columbia helps power homes, farms, factories, ports, and data centers across the U.S. Pacific Northwest. And now that river is caught inside a political fight. The Trump administration did not magically erase the original Columbia River Treaty overnight. That would be too simple. What it did was pause the modernization process after Canada and the United States had already reached an agreement in principle in 2024. And that pause matters because this treaty is not just paperwork. It is one of the physical systems holding the Pacific Northwest economy together. Here is the part Washington keeps forgetting. You can threaten tariffs. You can pause negotiations. You can demand a better deal. But you cannot force a river to flow uphill. That is the whole story. The Columbia River begins in Canada, flows through British Columbia, then moves south through Washington and Oregon before reaching the Pacific. That geography gives Canada a kind of leverage no press conference can erase. Because the United States is downstream, Canada is upstream. And in a water fight, upstream matters. To understand why this is so serious, go back to 1948. Vanport, Oregon, was destroyed by a catastrophic flood. That disaster helped teach the United States a hard lesson. America could build dams on its side of the border, but it could not fully control the river without Canada. The headwaters were in Canada. The storage was in Canada. The timing of the water mattered. So after years of negotiation, Canada and the United States signed the Columbia River Treaty, which came into force in 1964. The treaty led to major dam construction, 3 dams in British Columbia and 1 in Montana, to coordinate flood control and increase power generation. That was the deal. Canada flooded land. Canada changed communities. Canada built storage. The United States got flood protection and more predictable hydropower. And Canada got paid through what is called the Canadian entitlement, which Canada describes as worth roughly $180 million to $300 million per year for the added power generation made possible by Canadian dam operations. So let's be clear. This was never charity. It was not America doing Canada a favor. It was a transaction built around geography. The US needed upstream coordination. Canada provided it. And now Washington is acting as if the river is just another trade file. That is the mistake. Because the Columbia River is not lumber. It is not dairy. It is not steel. It is not auto parts. You cannot replace it with another supplier. You cannot import another watershed. You cannot rebuild 60 years of water coordination with one executive order. And you cannot tariff your way out of being downstream. Now hold on, because this is where the backfire begins. The treaty itself does not simply disappear because modernization slows down. The current treaty has no simple automatic expiry date. Either country can terminate most provisions only after September 2024 and only with at least 10 years written notice. Flood control arrangements also changed after 2024, moving toward on-call flood control unless new arrangements are fully settled. So if Washington thought pausing modernization would weaken Canada, the math is not that simple. The old treaty framework still matters. The river still flows from Canada. The dams still sit upstream. And the Pacific Northwest still depends on coordination. That is why this is not just a legal fight. It is a leverage fight. The Columbia River Basin is one of the most important hydropower systems in North America. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has reported that Columbia River Basin hydro plants account for a little more than 1/3 of U.S. hydroelectric capacity, while other regional reporting often describes the basin as generating around 40% of U.S. hydropower. So when people say 40% of U.S. hydropower at risk, do not imagine Canada flipping a switch tomorrow morning. That is not how this works. The real risk is not instant collapse. The real risk is fragility. More uncertainty. More mistrust. More pressure on utilities. More pressure on farmers. More pressure on shippers. More risk during droughts. More risk during floods. That is how a stable system becomes unstable. And the Columbia is not only electricity, it is irrigation, it is grain, it is ports, it is cargo, it is cheap industrial power. It is one of the reasons the Pacific Northwest became such a powerful economic region in the first place. So when Washington pulls back from modernization, it is not just annoying Canada. It is gambling with its own downstream economy. Now pause here, because this is where the whole debate becomes dishonest. Some people talk as if Canadian water is American water waiting to be claimed. But rivers do not care about slogans. The Columbia starts where it starts. The storage sits where it sits. The flow moves where gravity sends it. And gravity does not answer to Washington. That is why Carney's refusal matters. Not because Canada wants a water war. A water war would be reckless. Not because Canada can just shut everything off tomorrow. That is cartoon politics. Carney's real position has to be simpler and stronger. Canada should not surrender upstream leverage just because Washington gets loud. No panic. No overreaction. No pretending this is just another bargaining table. This is a 61-year water system that affects power, floods, food, shipping, and the future of the Pacific Northwest. Canada has to be calm, legal, strategic, and very aware of the map, because the map is the leverage. There are 3 ways this can go. First, Washington returns to the table. That is the smart path. The US gets stability. Canada gets fair recognition. Indigenous and ecological concerns stay inside the modernization framework. And the river stays managed like a shared system, not a political weapon. Second, the pause continues. That means the old framework keeps operating, but trust keeps weakening. The water still flows. The lights stay on. But everyone starts planning around uncertainty. That is not collapse, but it is dangerous. Third, the fight escalates. If tariff battles and energy threats keep expanding, the Columbia River could become another pressure point in the wider Canada-US confrontation. That is the nightmare scenario. Because once water cooperation becomes political leverage, everything gets riskier. Power planning gets riskier. Flood planning gets riskier. Agriculture gets riskier. Shipping gets riskier. And the cost of mistrust starts spreading through the system. That is why this story matters. The US is powerful, but it is not self-sufficient. It depends on Canadian water, Canadian energy, Canadian minerals, Canadian lumber, Canadian fertilizer, Canadian trade routes, Canadian cooperation. And every time Washington treats cooperation like weakness, Canada learns the same lesson. Dependence can become leverage when the other side forgets what it depends on. So here is the real Tradeconomics take. Trump did not erase the Columbia River Treaty in one move. But by pausing modernization and dragging this water system into the politics of pressure, Washington exposed one of America's quietest vulnerabilities. The Pacific Northwest's cheap power advantage blockage depends on a river system that begins in Canada. That system depends on cooperation, and cooperation depends on respect. If Washington forgets that, the risk is not just diplomatic tension. It is higher costs, weaker energy security, more fragile flood protection, and a future where the US has to relearn the oldest rule in geography. Downstream power is never absolute. Because you can threaten tariffs. You can pause talks. You can rewrite talking points. But you cannot negotiate with a river. And right now, the river starts in Canada. If this breakdown helped you understand what is really happening beneath the headlines, subscribe to Tradeconomics, share this video so others can see the bigger picture, and click the notification bell so you do not miss our next breakdown. At Tradeconomics, we follow the markets first, then expose the power mechanics underneath. See you in the next one.